Okay, so to start out with, just a little background about diagrams in general. They're basically like representations, like graphics, that are going to be kind of like abstract and distill information into a way that is less literal. So you might be taking elements of a site, such as how people are moving around a site or noise or things that you're sensing, and then you're just kind of distilling that information into a graphical way of talking about it. So that's basically what we're talking about.
So the purpose of diagrams. There are two really big purposes of diagrams. The first one is guiding your design process. So these are diagrams that you make early on that help you to give principles or constraints while you're designing to help you think about like the site or the flow of the site, how things move, and help you have more of a focus to your design and help you really make your design fit the site or have some guiding principle to it. That can take the shape of like going with the circulation, how that goes through the site. It can be the arrangement of elements on the site. It can be like where the sun is in relation to your site and where wind is, and if you're designing for that. Or it can be like circulation through the site or some general idea that you want to convey, like this side's going to be the light side and this side is going to be the shade side. Just some general things that can help you give some sort of focus to your design. So the second type is communication. These ones are more for a final product, and you should use diagrams really anywhere that it would take a lot of words to explain, or you can distill the elements down to their basic forms. So like the picture on the top right is showing how they did all of these steps to make this new shape for, I assume, a building. That would take a lot of words to explain, and people still probably wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. But with this series of diagrams, you can easily see how they got to that shape. They can also help you like show a certain element. So the bottom right one shows the circulation path that goes through two spaces, and it's showing how that goes through there. Whereas the ones on the left show several different processes that all fit together, but it breaks them down so you don't have to see them all at the same time. So these ones are more used to help support your idea at the end of the design phase when you're really presenting your project. So these are just some of the types of architectural diagrams. There are many more. You can diagram pretty much anything, but these are the main ones that you'll see or be asked to make in class. So a concept or a partie diagram, they're really the same thing. You'll hear them used interchangeably. It's really your idea distilled down into its essence. I always heard it as the 5 lines or less diagram. So it's showing some idea, not what your project looks like in a plan or elevation view, but like some idea that you took through the process. So the top one shows you what they were trying to show in those partie diagrams, but the bottom left ones, maybe they were trying to show a light versus dark idea or something like that. The one on the bottom right may be showing, I don't know, some neighborhood type thing where they're trying to decide like where some elements are going. I don't know. I don't know what these parties are of, but it's really just trying to get the essence of your idea into some very simple diagram. And parties / concept diagrams really should help you from the start to the finish. You may change it, you may redo it at the end, but like that's the core essence of your design. So a program diagram, this is showing where you put things and why you put them there, how things lay out in space. They can show size and spatial relationships. They can break down the elements individually. It can show adjacencies. The two main types of program diagrams are what you see on the right. The top one is a bubble diagram. This is much more conceptual, but it shows what the main elements are, how things primarily connect to each other versus secondarily connect to each other, just giving that broad idea of the space. The bottom one is showing the form of this building and what the spaces are all used for using those colors, and then they break those down. So those are two different, they communicate different things. The first one is more conceptual, the second one is more concrete with what it's showing. And then circulation diagrams. These are both done at the beginning and at the end, which is a little different than most diagrams. They show the movement through a space. It's also known as the space between the spaces. And they can show direction of movement, the types of users, times of day, frequency of use, or current versus proposed. So you can see on the right, they can be more conceptual or more like laid out straight on the site. You can use different colored lines to show primary versus secondary circulation, or different users of the space, or what the current site is versus what you're changing about it, but really useful to help you understand how people will actually move around in that space. And that's a really big thing why you do it at the beginning and at the end, because you don't want to mess up an entire circulation pattern because you decided something would look cool. That's not very helpful. So yeah. And then context diagrams. These are used mainly in the beginning. It's also sort of site analysis, but which Caleb's going to talk about, but somewhat on a larger scale. It's looking at what's around the site. So it can be at lots of different scales. If you're designing a building, it could be literally, I don't know, a couple buildings over. If you're designing, let's say, a park, it can be an entire city. And they can show you what is missing from the area, and that might inspire what you're putting on the site. It can also help inform your design. So if, say, it's part of a historical neighborhood, you can use that to design more of a historical looking building. Or if it's next to a bunch of greenways, it can help you maybe decide you want to put some green space in there and connect those greenways, things like that. So at the bottom on the left, you see them, it's a big space that they're breaking down into individual elements to see what information from those surrounding areas could be helpful to them. The center one is more of an actual like axon view of a city, and it's showing probably some adjacent buildings that are important. Whereas the one on the right probably had something to do with green space and water, and so they just highlighted that in more of a diagrammatic way. So lots of different ways of going about that.
Awesome. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about diagramming specifically when you're doing site analysis. And this is because what you guys are going to be doing in your architecture studios now is getting a site, and then the first thing you do with the site is obviously going to be some site analysis. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the types of diagrams that you might do and give you a little bit of specifics on how to go about getting the information and like representing the information that you'll be using in your next assignment. So one piece of information that you'll definitely want to include when you start doing your site analysis is sun paths and just the impact that sun has on any given site, especially in architecture. This is really important because it kind of helps you understand like if there's going to be any like passive heating or cooling, like where shadows are going to be projected. So there's lots of reasons why you want to know about your sun path. Ultimately, the way that you represent your sun path is going to be similar to those two diagrams you see on the left-hand side. So if it's in plan view, typically you'll just have someone kind of draw an approximate sun path that pretty much just represents the direction that the sun is going at a specific time during the year. Or if you're doing a diagram in section, you might draw it the way that you kind of see it down there. But in both cases, you have to get your information from a sun path diagram or a sun path. So that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side here. So this is one for Boulder, Colorado specifically. And the way that you sort of read one of these, I'm going to see if I can get like a laser. Can you see my, like when I move my mouse? Okay, cool. So you'll want to get used to reading these, but the way that you pretty much do it is say that you pick a point. We're going to use this orange line because that's today's date. And say that we want to know how tall, like what the angle of the sun is at 9 o'clock. So we'd find this orange line and we'd come to the 09, which represents 9 o'clock. So then we see that it's on the southern hemisphere, because you can see the south, the S over here. But then you got to find the concentric circle that's closest to. So in that case, it would be this circle that I'm kind of moving along. And then you can kind of follow that all the way to the top. You see that it lands at 20 degrees. So the way you'd read that is that at 9 o'clock on today's date, it's 20 degrees to the south is the sun. So yeah, getting kind of familiar reading these is going to help you be able to diagram your sun paths later on. Did you guys have any questions about reading that sun diagram? I know they're really confusing at first. Cool. All right, so another piece of information that you'll be including in your site analysis is wind. So this is, again, is a wind rose, and this one is specifically for Boulder, Colorado. The way that you read these is that wherever you see the predominant wind, it means that it's coming from that direction. So in this case, most of the wind in Boulder is coming from the west and southwest. So therefore, if you were doing your site analysis and you wanted to put wind, you would draw some kind of arrow or some kind of indication coming from the southwest that to you makes sense, represents wind. But again, the way that you find that information is looking up a wind rose that's specific to your site. So in this case, Boulder, Colorado, you can kind of read it like that. Another good piece of information that you'll be putting in site analysis diagrams often is topography. And you'll often kind of merge this with hydrology or kind of what water is doing on a site, since the two are obviously very closely related. So over here, you can see an example that I've done from a landscape architecture studio I'm in right now. Typically, what you'll just do to diagram topography is just actually draw out the lines on your site. That's a pretty good way to diagram it. And then you might want to diagram a couple places where if water theoretically fell on your site, just kind of show where that water would go, if there's any drains or areas that would collect. But this is just a good way to kind of get an understanding of where, like, what your site is doing in terms of its topography and like what water is doing on your site, since that'll almost always have some kind of impact on what you design later on. One thing that's also good to know is that when you're reading contour lines, if they are closer together, that means that a slope is steeper. If they kind of move further apart, then it's like a shallower slope. And that also when you're starting to draw out your topography lines will never cross, just because theoretically, if you think about it, you're basically saying when you draw a topography line that all of this area is at the same elevation. So you can't have those crossing, or else you would have like landforms stacking on top of each other in a way that just doesn't happen in reality. But just a good thing to keep in mind. Another piece of information that you'll always want to include is just greenery. This one's pretty easy because all you really have to include is just what you're seeing and observing. So if that's lawns, then you can represent that however you'd like. Same thing with trees. But one thing that's good to know is that typically the way that you will draw trees in plan view or on a diagram is sort of like you're seeing over here on the left. So the most basic version of this is just a dot with a circle around it to represent the stem of the tree or the trunk of the tree, and then the canopy. But you can kind of play with that with some different variations, as you can see here. So I think that one's probably the most self-explanatory. So yeah, another piece of information is the circulation diagrams, which Emily talked a lot about already. But basically the way that you gather this information is through careful observation. Oftentimes you'll kind of assume a circulation pattern about an area because you're seeing certain paths and streets. But oftentimes if you actually go to the site and watch what people are doing for about half an hour, you might realize that there's actually paths that people aren't using very much, or there's places that people are going where there's not a path. So it's usually helpful to observe before you start diagramming your circulation. You can really diagram your circulation multiple different ways. A lot of people do it differently, but oftentimes being cognizant of arrow hierarchy, so having really thick arrows maybe for like cars or very heavily trafficked areas, and then thinner arrows for less trafficked areas is really helpful, as well as using color coding and all those things to make sure that you're making a super readable circulation diagram. Another piece of information that people often do is noise, because most sites have some kind of noise pollution. Again, these are pretty self-explanatory. You'll usually just kind of indicate noise with some kind of icon that you like, and then maybe make an annotation about what that noise is coming from. And then as you are doing your site analysis in your architecture studio, the ones that I just talked about are the ones that most likely your professor will say are non-negotiable, that you'll want to make sure that you're having all that information. But there's so many other things that could be relevant, and it's very site specific what kind of information you want to include. But really anything that feels relevant to your site is something that you should consider diagramming. So that could be diagramming key views that you see on a site, like you have a nice view of the Flatirons, site history, if there's anything informational that you find there, ground plane materials, subjective feelings, like how much you like one corner of the site compared to another. You can read my list here, it goes on and on. But pretty much there's endless amounts of information, and not every site is going to have a need for you to diagram all that information. But anything that you feel is relevant is definitely good to diagram when you're starting out, just because that's going to later inform a much better design. And then finally, before we jump into a little bit of practice, you'll just want to keep in mind that this is your toolbox. You have tons of ability to be creative when you're diagramming. There are some conventions that you can see on the left about what kind of arrows you might use for specific things, but you want to be creative with your icons and the marks you're making and the tools that you're using to make sure that you're creating readable diagrams, that you always have a key and a north arrow and those sorts of things. And that you're just using everything at your disposal to be as communicative as possible and present your information in a way that people will understand.